everybody. Today I am back exploring the Optimist mixable inks or colors. I've got a whole set here. They're from Federal. I love them for lots of things, but now I've been challenged to see how they work on fabric. So I've laid a few tests out here that I've already experimented with so that I could be sure about what I'm sharing with you. But let's talk about some of the variables that are going to really make a difference here. Okay, so first up is a silk habotai. This is also referred to as China silk. Here's a piece that hasn't been colored yet. You can see how silky and flexible it is. This is a beautiful fabric. You can also see that it's translucent. You can see through it. This is one of my favorite fabrics to print and dye. And of course, when you dye, you've got all the batching time, and sometimes you have to steam the fabric. And so I was really curious whether these Optimist inks might actually be a quicker route to getting the kind of coloring that you're seeing here on a sample that I already played with. And I'll demonstrate this in a minute. This fabric is a very, the way I describe it when I talk about dyeing, it's what's called a plain weave. So the threads that go across this way are the same as the threads that go across this way. And they're very smooth, it's silk, so they're very smooth, slick threads. And that means that most of the time, there's a lot of capillary action, meaning that the dye or whatever you're using, the colorant, shoots across the threads. And that means that this is a fabric that's prone to bleeding, okay? Next up in my samples is a piece of cotton. Cotton is also a plain weave, but cotton threads are a little bit heavier and they're a completely different composition from silk, obviously. Silk is from a silkworm, cotton is from a cotton plant. And so that makes the threads slightly different, and that means that cotton is not quite as likely to bleed. So we'll see what that does. And then here I have an example of a fabric that is sometimes called raw silk and sometimes called silk noil, N-O-I-L. Silk noil is also a silk fabric, but it's made with a twisted thread. And when you weave a twisted thread, it stops that capillary action because it's not a smooth course for the dye or the paint or with the color and whatever you're using to go shooting along it in a smooth sort of linear way. Instead, the colorant or the liquid would, no matter what it is, even if it's water, gets slowed down by the twisted nature of the woven thread. So that's why I chose these fabrics. So we'd have three to compare. Now I'm going to take this piece of silk that I have not yet printed. And first up is stamping. Okay, so stamps can come in lots of shapes and forms and sizes. I'm using an eraser stamp that I cut using an X-Acto knife. There are a lot more elaborate kinds of stamps that you can make, but for the sake of our experiments, this is good enough. All right, so over here I have my tray, and I'm going to squeeze some Optimist ink. It can separate. Now, remember, or maybe you haven't even seen the other videos I did, you might want to check those out. Optimist is actually shellac-based. So that means that it's permanent when it dries, and this particular brand or mixture formula is specifically designed to be color fast, and that means it's fade resistant. And I got some notes the last time I posted an Optimist video on YouTube questioning whether or not shellac would actually be permanent over the long haul or whether it would yellow. But the company that makes these, at least at this point, and they're a new product, has a great deal of confidence in the colors being stable. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze a little bit of this out there. And while I'm at it, I'll put a couple other colors out there too. Let's see. See, in my other tests, I used red and orange, so this time I'm going to go with a blue. These colors are all intermixable. And they also come with a clear, colorless shellac medium, and that can thin the color down in case you want a more pastel version of it. The kit I bought also comes with a white, and the white is more opaque. There's what it looks like. And if you add that to the colors, then you will get opacity, which basically means they're no longer transparent or translucent. Okay, so before we even do the stamp, let's just grab a brush and compare how these look in a single brush stroke, okay? So I'm going to dip into the blue and just make a brush stroke here. Let me close in a little bit so that you can see that that is bleeding a little bit, but it's holding, it's good. Well, let's put a little yellow next to it and see what happens if they bleed into each other. Now, the good news is that as long as you're working wet, as I am, you can use water to clean your brush, and you can also add water not only to lighten, but also to blend the colors a little bit. Okay. So that's what the silk looks like with just brush strokes. Now, as long as I have this here, I'm going to go ahead and get a slightly different brush, and I'm going to see what the stamping looks like. I prefer to coat a stamp using a brush because I have more control, as opposed to dipping into the wet paint on the tray. Pull that up so you can see it a little bit better. Now, it is bleeding on this fabric. See right here? Now, may I say, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it could be used to your advantage. But you want to know if that's going to happen in advance, because it will help you make the right choice of fabric. So let's set the silk aside. And now we'll bring in the cotton, and we'll bring in this piece that I've already begun experimenting on, because I don't use cotton much, so I don't have much cotton, to tell you the truth. And I'm going to take the blue and do the same thing I did. I'm going to brush a stroke of blue up here, add a little bit more to that. So at the start of my brush stroke, it is bleeding a little bit, but by the end of the brush stroke, it's not. And it only wicks out a little bit and then it stops. Let's see what happens if I come across this way. So if what you were wanting to do was hand paint with these, and you were thinking that you wanted kind of a loose effect or a combination, what's beautiful about this is it's kind of loose, but it's also got some structure. And if I controlled the brush a little bit more, I could avoid having so much bleeding, and I could keep it more like what you see right here. Now let's check out the stamp. Pull the fabric up so you can see it. I'm working in close so that you can see the result up close and personal. So even on this cotton, which is the equivalent of muslin, or what they call in the UK calico, I'm getting a little bit of bleed, but I'm also getting, to tell you the truth, kind of an organic quality that I really like. Pull that up a little bit more so you can see it. So that has real potential, in my opinion. because I'm very fond of the organic nature of this and not having things be quite so crisp and clean. And another thing about this I may have said is that once these dry, they're not like watercolors. They can't be re-wetted. They can't be reworked. And so when this dries, it's not quite dry, but I'm dying to show you. If I take another color and I brush color over this, the color doesn't change. And since they're translucent or transparent, actually, they're more transparent than they are translucent, you can see through them in order to see the patterning. So this would be a really cool way to build up some pattern, even if you only use these for the background, because frankly, one thing that's really nice is they don't change the hand. Okay, let's look at the silk noil next. Okay, this has a texture. Maybe you can't really see it. But remember I said this is a twisted thread, so it's going to behave a little differently when I lay down the color. So let's try that blue again. Now that is really pleasing. So even where most of the paint is distributed, because it's just the nature of using brushes, right, that you push down and then you make the stroke. If I was going a little bit lighter, let's see what would happen. Yeah, see, I can lighten up the stroke just fine. So that's a matter of operator control. But you see, even where I've put down a lot of ink here at the beginning, it doesn't bleed at all, and it's the nature of the fabric. Now, this might also be true on canvas, probably unprimed canvas. So if you're someone who's working on canvas and you're interested in these, I think there's a lot of potential for using them. But of course, every single fabric, or every single, I should say, substrate, which is how I refer to the backgrounds, whether they're paper or fabric, every single substrate will be a little bit different, which is why it behooves us to experiment with different backgrounds until we find one that we like that does what we want it to do and that fits with our basic game plan of what we have in mind to do. So let's try this now. Let me pull this up again. Actually, I'll flip it around so we have more working space. So the same thing is basically true with stamping. When you stamp with these, the stamp doesn't bleed at all the way it did on the lighter weight silk. And it's all because of the structure of the fabric. Okay. So you can see no bleeding at all. Now, the other cool thing about this, whether you've hand painted or whether you've stamped like this, is that when it's dry, you don't necessarily have to cover it with more Optimist ink. You could use a thin coat of acrylic, watered down. You could use dye. In other words, I could do a whole piece of fabric with this sort of printing in the Optimist inks, and then I could put it in a dye bath and the Optimist ink wouldn't be affected at all, but the color would come in around it. And that could be a really beautiful effect too. So that's part one of playing with the Optimist inks on fabric. And I will say that I have washed samples and the colors remain. Now, here's the thing. Make sure you wait. Let's go up a little bit. Make sure you heat set, meaning iron. Once this is dry, give it a nice iron. High heat, steam doesn't matter either way, but press it. I think that's just good practice, because when you're using any kind of a product on fabric, it's always a really good idea to iron it once it's dry, to make sure that that you're doing the best job you can to keep it from fading or from bleeding in the wash. Okay, so that's the first thing, is to heat set it. And then once you heat set it, I washed it on gentle, or you can hand wash, and you can either throw it in the dryer, or in the case of this sample, which has been washed, you see it bled because it's that silk habotai, but I didn't lose any color at all. And I'll go into stamping and silk screening in part 2 so that this isn't too long a video, but I'm really glad you've been here. And I hope that's enough to encourage you to get started. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in the Optimist inks, scroll down and there is a link there that I hope you will use if you're thinking of purchasing them, because I do get a small percentage, and that helps fund more of my experiments so that I can share them with you.